moved. I don't like my camera being moved like that, but... So the title of the video is fairly obvious. We're going to be discussing the least useful skills in Diablo 4. And the reason why I'm highlighting least useful instead of the worst skills is because some of these skills are actually useful. They're just tied to extremely specific builds or extremely niche uses in a build. And that's one of the main reasons I want to talk about. So, we're going to start off. I want to first start by covering the Sorceress. We'll go to Sorceress and we will work our way down. Let's go to Yennefer. So, the main thing... Phone call. The main thing that we're going to be covering... Just hold your titties for a minute. The main thing that we're going to be covering when we talk about the least useful skills is we're covering the skills that have the biggest niche applications or that in some cases need full-on reworks. So, of the 4 classes, we're going to try and keep this relatively short and sweet and not spend as much time as I would normally spend on each character. Looking specifically at Sorceress, we're not going to be commenting on enchantments. Enchantments can be very build dependent as well. We're also not going to be factoring in basic skills because most categories tend to look at basic skills as being an afterthought. A lot of high-end builds don't put any points into the basics. They try and focus on other things. So let's ignore basics. We're going to ignore basics. We're going to ignore enchantments. The worst core skill in the game is Incinerate. It's a mana cost per second, lucky hit chances per second per hit. What it does is it does damage per second, and the damage per second will increase the longer you hold down the individual button. The downside to the system of damage per second is that you are locked in to this ability. You stand still, put your hand up, and you start throwing around fire. 1, you lose your mobility. Every other skill that is over here, you cast a skill, you go away. You cast and move. Cast and move. They're not skills that are going to directly tie you in place. Now, if you look at what you get, okay. Wall channeling, Incinerate, you burn enemies around you for 25% of the damage per second. This is good for passive AoE fire damage. Okay, so maybe we do a flamethrower hybrid build that does AoE damage. Enemies deal less damage while burning from Incinerate, which does stack with this. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of defensiveness. And then every 3 seconds an enemy has been hit by Incinerate, they get immobilized for 1 second. This is good for the Pyro build. Well, why is this skill so bad besides the lack of mobility? Alright, look at the damage per second that you have to hold down the mana bar for 4 seconds to get the maximum benefit of the skill, whereas all of these other abilities that get access to damage skills, the damage that they are applying is much more consistent than Incinerate. Incinerate relies a lot on burning damage and damage over time. If you don't have that damage to be able to do it, or you don't have the ability to stand still, this skill is a death sentence. It's one of the least used fire skills in the game. Ice Blades is definitely something that I could throw on this list as much as I'm tempted to do, specifically for Sorceress. I'm not going to, though. The reason why is the Conjuration build that runs all of the Conjurations is relatively good. It's not great, but it's good. You also get a few other niche applications that make it okay. For one, it has a relatively short cooldown at 16 seconds. Stays up for 6 seconds. It damages enemies. There's a 40% chance it makes it vulnerable. You can spawn it for free with the enchantment. There's ways to reduce cooldown by vulnerable. You can apply that cooldown reduction to other skills, so you can slot it just for the cooldown reduction. Although I wouldn't necessarily use that. The attack speed's okay. It's one of those skills that you're going to have a hard time slotting in, but it can be valuable. So I'm going to throw it in there as an honorable mention. We're not going to cover too much time on it. The majority of the mastery skills are good. They have good applications. They have a lot of legendaries around them. One thing I want to mention is Ball Lightning. Now, if you notice, I am running Ball Lightning on this build. Ball Lightning specifically is a build that requires the legendary aspect to be viable on it. Most other builds that are out there can get by to some degree without a legendary aspect tied to it. This is not one of those exceptions. You need the one where, I believe, Ball Lightning orbits around you and deals bonus damage. The reason why you need that is because of how the base version of the skill works, where the Ball of Lightning, the small Ball of Lightning, slowly goes forward zapping energies. The mana cost for it is way too high at a base of 50. Mana cost is way too high for a Ball of Lightning that is not going to be hitting that many enemies. It's a very small radius. It's not going to do a lot. With the orbit on it, it's pretty good. Ultimates are fairly good as well, which will lead us into the key passives. I'm not going to cover the individual passives that are in the tree. I was thinking about doing this. I really don't want to. I might make this on another day. But looking specifically at key passives, Ice has 2 that are very good. Lightning has 1 that's good. 1 that's kind of meh. But this requires dedicated build. If you make dedicated crackling energy builds, you're going to run this. It's fine. Looking at fire, combustion is good in a pure fire build where your burning effects get bonus damage. You get additional burning damage for every individual source of burning that you're applying, so you can get even more. It is not uncommon to potentially have 7 or 8 ways of burning an enemy. So 7 different ways of getting burning damage reliably. Your 6 skills plus an enchantment. Maybe 2 enchantments. That's a very, you might look at that and say that, okay, well, 2%, but if I'm having 7 types of burning damage, meaning potentially 34% bonus burning damage, that's not bad, but in my opinion, it's kind of outmatched by Isu's Ferocity. Isu's Ferocity increases crit damage and crit chance against enemies. Fire likes crit, it likes damage over time. So, these are not insignificant bonuses that you're getting, especially since they buffed this skill. I think it is a bit outmatched. Combustion is just outmatched by that. It's kind of the worst of the fire passives. That covers that. Should give me the ability to switch between characters in games instead of logging out and logging in. Those, in my opinion, are really the worst sorceress skills that you have the hardest time doing. Next up, we're going to go to Barbarian. Barbarian is in an interesting place because Barbarian has a lot of these skills that you look at and say they're trash because of how good a few other skills are, like the shouts, like how good all of the shouts are. It's kind of like you could just sum up everything as being trash. I specifically want to highlight skills that don't really have a general useful application. They're just niche. Okay? So, again, we're now covering basic skills. For core skills, the worst core skill is probably Double Swing. You could make the argument for Rend, but Rend has a dedicated build going to it. There's a dedicated bleed build that Rend has, and it's Rend and Flay with the bleed build. I'm not going to throw this in there because if you are running a bleed build Barbarian, you're going to run Rend. I know a lot of people run Whirlwind, and they run the bleeding aspect on it instead, but it's common enough in a bleed build. Ignore that. Double Swing is the worst core skill. It uses your one-handed weapons, which are your weaker damage output weapons. You swing from the sides, you take the damage. It's not bad. It has a 25 Fury cost base, and you can get that Fury cost back if you damage a stun or knockdown enemy. This is really the primary synergy of it and why this is a less useful skill. You need to be consistently hitting stunned enemies. So you want to play into the bleed, where the anemic aspect, where bleeding procs a stun. Close enemies proc a stun. You want ground stomp for a stun. You really want to be running stun. This means you want to run bludgeoning to an extent as well. You want to be stunning enemies a lot so that you can go double swing for the damage. Some people have paired up bash with it, but bash isn't really great because if you're trying to build dedicated into the one-handed weapons, you want frenzy, not bash. I mean, you can get bonus berserk off of it, and you can get bonus vulnerable off of it. The main synergy it has is off of that stun knockdown build, where you're pretty much instantly getting your Fury back as long as you're damaging a stunned enemy. This is good for single target DPS in kind of a pseudo berserk build, where you're just always berserking. But always berserking builds don't stun a lot. That's the main reason why the synergies on it are off. You can build it one way, you can build it the other way. If you're running berserk, you're probably better off with upheaval for violent upheaval. And if you're running stun, you're probably better off with either upheaval or hammer because you're bludgeoning anyways. I'm not going to throw Iron Skin on this list as much as I want to, because many people use Iron Skin. I personally don't. I hate Iron Skin. I think this is a trash ability. I'm in the minority on this one, and I'm majorly in the minority on this one, so we're going to move along. Even though I'm not, like I said, I think this ability needs a complete rework in my opinion. This is just such a lackluster ability. But moving on. A lot of people throw kick, leap, charge. They like to throw these in. We're not going to talk about leap. Leap is relatively common to run. We're not going to talk about kick. Kick is niche application as kind of a Fury spender. It's a bursty Fury spender that you can run if you are a berserking barbarian that doesn't want to run a core skill. If you don't want to run core skill, if you want to run, you know, one-handed berserk basic bitch build, kick is a good way to get rid of it. And the reason why I say kick is because kick can make enemies vulnerable, pop all your Fury, or you can use it for vulnerable and knock down / knock back in the double swing build. I like kick. I really like it. I think it's a good skill. The fact that it has multiple charges, the cooldown's relatively short, it has good value. The skill we're going to be talking about here is charge. What charge does is it makes you unstoppable, and that's pretty much all that this skill really does. It's an extra way to cancel crowd control immunity, because the damage is terrible, the movement skill is terrible, and the cooldown is a bit too high. If you want to buff this, make the charge longer, where I can hold charge. The longer I hold charge to keep moving forward, the longer the cooldown is. Increase the damage on it more. Now you could say, well, the damage is relatively on par with Leap, right? Leap's 33%, this is 25%. Leap has much easier resets on it. You can reset the cooldown of Leap with Kick or Ground Stomp. Leap has a lot more legendary aspects available to it. Charge does not. Charge does 1. And it basically just gives you extra charge. So what else does charge do? Enemies who are knocked back into terrain take bonus damage and get stunned, which is great, but you're not always going to be in a situation around terrain. Charge's cooldown is reduced for each enemy it knocks into terrain up to 9 seconds, meaning you can get the cooldown reduction down to 8 seconds. That's not very good. In addition to that, Mighty Charge, damaging enemies with charge makes them vulnerable. That's the main synergy, is you can use it in vulnerable builds. If you're trying to run extra vulnerable skills for whatever reason, this is one of the main ways you can benefit. This is unfortunately a lackluster skill unless you are running a brawling build, or unless you are looking for an extra form of Unstoppable. I have an extra form of Unstoppable, and I'm genuinely thinking of switching it out to Ground Stomp just to get an extra way to deal damage. It's just not that effective for me. For the weapon masteries, Rupture has a legendary and is part of the bleed build. We're not talking about that. Death Blow, I think, is fantastic, even if people don't use it. Most people unilaterally agree Steel Grasp is terrible. So, it's a short cooldown. It has multiple charges. Why is it terrible? Okay, so what it does is it throws out chains. They pull enemies in. They do a little bit of chip damage. The chip damage is not very good. The main benefit is that they pull enemies in. Here's the problem that I have. Your first skill makes it to where enemies are vulnerable for 3 seconds. So the main use of this skill by default is vulnerable. Then you could pair that with either Berserk or Bonus Charge. Bonus Charge is good in non-Berserk builds, but you'll never run this in a non-Berserk build. I've tried to. It's not worth it. Plus, you get the extra charge anyways off of the Weapon Mastery. Weapon Mastery is getting an additional charge. So you can get this for free, basically, off of a legendary aspect you're going to run anyways, if you run this skill. The main reason you run it is for the Berserk Vulnerable. If you need to proc Vulnerable, you need to proc Berserk, you run this. The problem is that that's all that this skill does. It's inconsistent that it pulls enemies in, so you're literally only using it to proc those two effects. And there are better ways to proc Vulnerable. If you want to proc Vulnerable, you can do that off of Charge. You can do that off of Kick. You can do that off of... Can you do it off? You can do it off of any core skill with Pressure Point. Right? That right there is much more... Those are much more reliable methods of Vulnerable than Steel Grasp is. Because that's, again, that's all you're doing. If you want Berserking, that's the main reason you would do it. Because it doesn't need to do anything other than just hit an enemy. If it hits an enemy, whether it pulls them, damages them, whatever, you get Berserk for 2 seconds. That's the main reason you would run this. If you're not running, and even then, Berserking Barbarians don't even want to run this. Berserking Barbarians go, you know, basic, Whirlwind, 3 Shouts, Wrath of the Berserker type build. To me, I would buff this. I would make it to where it has the 3rd charge by default. There's no upgrade to charges. This synergizes to something else. Or make the vulnerable by default. And then Berserking could have something else. Like, say, if you didn't pull the enemy in, it suns them. For the ultimates, a lot of people talk about Iron Maelstrom being terrible, but in all seriousness, Iron Maelstrom is... The problem that this skill has is just it's not impactful enough, therefore it has a shorter cooldown to compensate at 45%. In addition to this, I really just think that the way you can buff this skill and make it more valuable is that the effects that are given are better, right? Your two-handed bludgeoning weapon, like this should be something like, okay, you put a timer on each skill. For a certain duration, each skill that uses one of those weapons deals that bonus. Outside of, like, the skill generally being trash, it's not bad. It does directly increase crit damage, crit strike, and you can get the cooldown reduction on it very quickly to where it's a main skill. I don't think it's useless. I do think it's not useful. I think that the problem that this has is it's supposed to synergize with Walking Arsenal, and it just simply doesn't. It doesn't synergize enough in Walking Arsenal to where I want it. Walking Arsenal works better with Call of the Ancients because of the legendary aspect. If there was a stronger unique or a stronger legendary aspect to Iron Maelstrom, where, say, killing an enemy with Iron Maelstrom takes a certain flat cooldown off, that would be much better. But as it stands right now, this is on the weaker side. I don't think that there's really a terrible ultimate that's least useful. All of them are good if you build around them. They're pretty generic. I say Maelstrom, Steel Grasp, Charge definitely need the most work. Even Double Swing is not bad. It's just that Double Swing is kind of the least effective of the core skills. Upheaval and Hammer have better burst. And Whirlwind is consistent. Rend is a specific build. Necromancer. This list is going to be relatively short, believe it or not. And that's because Necromancer has such hard build requirements on it. It's hard to really look at a skill and say, it's terrible. It's like you're like trying to justify a reason. You can make a legitimate reason for the majority of the skills that Necromancer has. So when we're looking at Necromancer skills that need work, what we're going to be looking at, again, we're not talking about the basics. When it comes to core skills, I don't think any of these core skills are bad. Blight has a purpose. It's not a great purpose, but it has a purpose. You could say, well, this is not good. It's only for Shadow Blight, but only being in a specific build isn't bad if it's ran in every version of the build. So none of the core skills are going to make it. None of the basic skills are going to make it. Alright? A lot of people think that Corpse Explosion kind of sucks. I'm going to disagree with you on that. Corpse Explosion has multiple uses. One is you can use it for the Shadow Miasma, where you get the shadow damage over time for Shadow Blight. Another one is it doesn't have a cooldown, it doesn't have an essence cost. It's high lucky hit chance. It consumes corpses, and consuming corpses can give you essence or increased damage. So automatically, this skill is not terrible. People say it is. What we are going to talk about that's terrible in this tree is Bone Prison. Long cooldown, creates a prison, surrounds the target area for 6 seconds. That is all it does, is it traps enemies in an area on a cooldown. You have to run the bonuses to get effects. What does it do? You gain a certain amount of essence flat. So a lot of people say, okay, you can use this as an essence generating skill. You can use Corpse Explosion, Bone Prison, Iron Maiden for essence generation. Here's the problem with that. Iron Maiden's enhanced version, where you gain essence for each enemy curse, doesn't work on enemies already cursed. That's not bad. It's not a lot of essence, sure, but I can spam that. Corpse Explosion to generate essence. Okay, you might look at that and say the essence is low on both of these. Okay, sure, but I can spam these. These don't have cooldowns on them. This is a 17-second cooldown for 25 essence plus 5 per enemy trapped. Okay, let's ignore that for a minute. If you're in a boss fight, guess what you got? 25 essence. Because it only works if they're trapped. Bosses can't be trapped. So if you hit it with it, you get 25 essence. You're not getting the bonus trap on that. I have tested that theory. Okay. This, in order to generate 25 essence with Corpse Explosion and Grim Harvest, I have to pop 6 corpses. Iron Maiden, 5 essence, 5 corpses. Or 5 enemies. No cooldowns on those. The other thing is that enemies inside Bone Prison are vulnerable. That's a very good thing. Here's the thing. You can run Corpse Tendrils on a 10-second cooldown and get vulnerable off of that. It's a shorter cooldown. It's a more useful skill. And then you can get Fortify for each enemy. So Blood Necros will occasionally run this. Yeah, Yeah, no, this skill needs work. The one legendary aspect where you get Shadow Blight for the corpse, or for the bone prison, isn't very good. Shadow Blight doesn't want to run this. They'd rather run Corpse Explosion, they'd rather run Blight, they'd rather run defensive skills, they'd rather run Tendrils to suck them all in. They don't want to run Bone Prison. This skill needs a complete rework. This skill needs massive buffs, massive legendary improvement. This skill is terrible. There's no reason to run this over Explosion, Tendrils, or Curse. Curses are very niche. If you want to say Decrepify is arguably the best. Iron Maiden has niche application. I don't really want to say it's bad. I think the problem with Iron Maiden is you use it in one of two situations. You use it on a minion build, so minions get benefits of the damage. You can get healing off of it. You can get increased damage. You can get the essence cost on it. I think there's a lot of uses for it. It's just fighting for spots in Necromancer builds. Decrepify, where enemies deal less damage, they get slowed, there's a chance they can get stunned, cooldown reduction. I think there's a lot going on with Decrepify, same thing, you're just fighting to slot it. So these skills are not useless, they're just fighting with better skills. Corpse Tendrils is great, Bone Spirit is great. This is the one we want to talk about. Army of the Dead Ultimate Skill. Bloodwave and Bone Storm need legendary aspects to be good. That's not a negative. With the legendary aspects, they're very good. Bloodwave having cooldown reduction off of blood orbs and having the multicast makes it good. Bone Storm has tons of shit around it. And just the damage reduction alone is good. What does Army of the Dead do? Okay. For 7 seconds, skeletons pop up, they blow up, they deal AoE damage. They have a 15% chance to leave behind a corpse. That's nothing. I can get that off of other skills much easier. The main value you could get out of it would be that they raise your warriors and your mages when you cast it. Okay? They raise all of them. No corpses required. Really though? On a 66-second cooldown. This skill just doesn't have enough going on with it. There's a legendary aspect while active, your minions get massive damage reduction, massive attack speed bonus. Yeah, here's the thing though. I would rather run Bone Storm for crit and damage reduction. Bone Storm is literally superior in every way. The damage output is terrible. It's 45 damage. The cooldown is too long. Literally the only reason you would run this is auto raise on minions when there's no corpses around. Which even then, just generate corpses in there instead. For the key passives, the damage ones are all good. They all have a niche. The one a lot of people forget about is Kalen's Edict. A lot of people say that this is great in minion builds. I run a minion build, and I don't run this. Whenever you have not taken damage for the last 2 seconds, your minions gain 15% attack speed. This is an additive, not a multiplicative effect. So it's 15% on top of whatever else you have going, which is good. While you have 7 minions, the bonus gets doubled. This is fairly easy to achieve because there's the aspect for an extra 2 mages, there's the aspect for the extra 2 warriors, so you can get 5 mages and 6 to 7 warriors by default. 8 with skirmishers, plus a golem. There's a lot of ways you can cheese at 7 minions. The problem is twofold. 1, you take damage, your minions lose the bonus. 2, minions die, you lose half your bonus. Minions die a lot in combat. A lot. In addition to this, it makes you kind of dependent on your minions to do anything. Whereas, if you're running a minion build, you're already losing 2 slots out of a potential of 6. Okay? If you're running an ultimate, you're losing an additional slot. If you're running Blood Mist, you're running an additional slot. If you're running Corpse Explosion or Corpse Tendrils or Bone Prison or a Curse, you're running an additional spot that's not directly buffing damage dealing capabilities. A lot of people talk about the auto build, the sort of auto build that you can run on Necromancer, where you're running Golem, you're running Minions, you're running Corpse Explosion, you're running Blood Mist, you're running Corpse Tendrils, you're running basically anything that doesn't deal damage for the most part, and you just sit there and let your minions do all the work. Here's the problem with that. What happens when the minions die, or they can't do enough damage? Now you suffer, you lose a lot of potential output. Literally any other aspect is better. If this bonus also granted bonus damage to minions, if this bonus had a shorter minion bonus, or if it made it to where if you have at least one minion alive, you got a percentage of this bonus no matter what, even if you haven't tanked damage. So, like, as long as you have one minion of each type active, you get 10% attack speed, regardless of whether or not you've taken damage. That could be better to buff this. Right now, there's literally no reason to run it. Shadow Blight is better with any type of shadow damage. Rathma's Vigor is better with any type of blood. It's just generically useful even in minion builds for the 10% maximum health. The Ossified Essence for the bone skills is good in any type of bone build except for Bone Prison. So, Kalen's Edict and Army of the Dead really need a rework. Bone Prison really need a rework. Last class to cover is Druid. Keep it relatively short and sweet. Relatively. Druid has a lot of synergy that's very good. And they're also heavily legendary aspect and unique dependent. So it's harder to judge skills. But I'm generally trying to pick around 3 or 4 skills in each class to talk about that need improvement, hoping that somebody or some form of a developer sees this and is able to do something to improve the builds a little bit. Might not improve it a lot, but any little bit helps for some of these lackluster skills. Alright, so again, we're not going to cover the basics. We're not going to cover the cores. Landslide is very good in Earths if you know how to build it. Lightning Storm, very good in Lightning if you know how to build it. A lot of people like running Tornado with the auto-target aspect. Pulverize is very good for leveling. People say Shred is a weak link. Shred has really good legendaries for it. All of these skills seem lackluster. Like, Tornado without the aspect is lackluster. Lightning Storm in a non-pure lightning build is very lackluster. But if you're pure lightning, this skill is awesome. This skill nukes a large portion of the screen. Pulverize requires one aspect and you're cooking. Shred requires one aspect and you're cooking. Landslide requires one aspect and you're cooking. Having one aspect isn't a bad thing if it scales properly enough. If I have to pick the worst out of the core skills, because I've done one for everybody for the most part, except for Necromancer, I would probably say it would be Shred. Shred's really complicating and time-consuming to learn how to use, where you're doing combo attacks left, right, and center. It's not an intuitively obvious skill, but it does redeem itself where you get attack speed and healing off of it, which is pretty good for werewolf builds. All of the defensive ones are pretty good. The lackluster option to me is Debilitating Roar. Pure Werebear only. You're not using this in Werewolf, Nature's Fury build. You're not using this pretty much anything. 70% damage reduction is great, but it's nearby enemies only. It's not 70% damage reduction to you. It's hitting the enemies, and while the enemies are afflicted by it, they deal less damage. Meaning a corpse bow off-screen can still one-shot you in high-tier nightmare dungeons because you don't get the benefit of it. It's for nearby enemies. That's the main reason I don't like it. Cyclone Armor gives you the damage reduction. Now you can get some good stuff off of it. You can get Fortify, you can get a slow, or a heal off of it. The heal is on par with Bloodhowl's heal, but it's over the duration instead of instant. I personally think that if this was reduced to where it reduced the damage you take flat amount for a shorter duration and a shorter percentage, I would be fine with that. If it made it to where you took 50% less damage for 2 seconds, skill's perfectly fine. I genuinely think that. I think that balances it. Or if it was even lower than that and every point you put into it increased it. So for example, you could start this at say 10% and every point up that you put into Debilitating Roar would increase it. But I would put the duration at about 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds. Something like that. This is okay in that build. But as it stands now, it sucks independently because it's nearby enemies. Nearby enemies get killed very quickly by pulverizing. A lot of people talk shit about Companion. Wolves are good. Wolves are okay. Poison Creeper's okay because of the active for the Immobilize and the Poison. Poison Creeper has redeeming quality. Raven is quite possibly one of the worst skills in the game. It's up there with Incinerate, Steel Grasp, and Bone Prison. It is arguably the single worst skill here. So you get a passive of one Raven that flies around you and pecks at enemies every 5 seconds. Okay, 1. You know what wolves do? Wolves give you 2 companions. Okay, 2, and they attack consistently. They're not on a timer. Now, yes, you could look at the Ravens and say, well, Ravens deal more damage. But Ravens are on a 5-second attack timer. They have a longer cooldown as well at 14 seconds. The target area getting swarmed for massive damage, but it's over 6 seconds. This is an instant hit skill right here. Sure, it's less damage. It's only 135%, where that's 160% without scaling, right? Just base version. Here's the thing, though. This is a shorter cooldown, and it's instant. This is over time on a longer cooldown. You could look and say, lucky hit chance. It's a worse lucky hit chance. Then look at the bonuses. 5% increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds after they're hit by a Raven. Okay, Ravens hit every 5 seconds. So one enemy you're going to have a permanent crit chance against. Great. 2 additional Ravens periodically attack enemies. Okay, great. The passive damage of Ravens has increased by 40%. That doesn't buff it up to 60%, mind you. That buffs it up by 40% of the 20%, meaning you're getting roughly an extra 4 to 5%, which is still every 5 seconds. Or enemies inside the Ravens, when it's activated, become vulnerable for 3 seconds. So it's extra vulnerable proc. It's not like Druid has tons of ways to proc vulnerable. This is unfortunately the worst skill. Like, the only reason you would run this is companion only build. If you're running the companion build where you lose a ring and a glove and 2 rings, or at least 1 ring for the companion build, sure, it's great. You're gonna run it to run it. Other than that, there's no reason to run it. We're gonna skip over these. Rabies has use for Poison Werewolf. Dedicated build, not very good on its own. The reason why I'm highlighting it, I'm gonna skip it because I want to cover 2 ultimates. I want to cover Petrify, and I want to cover Lacerate. Petrify is terrible. It's a 47-second cooldown, okay? What it does is it stuns all enemies for 3 seconds, increases critical strike damage against them by 30%. In theory, that's good. The stun, however, is too long. That's the problem. It is way too long of a cooldown for just that stun. Now, the bosses, the stun is increased to 6 seconds. The crit bonus is increased by 50. Here's the problem. Bosses don't stun. Bosses stagger. So, what this does is it increases the duration of a stun to a stagger bar. Petrify's effect duration increased by 1 second. That's meaningless. And then killing an enemy affected by Petrify grants Spirit. So essentially, you can basically go Petrify, big AoE damage skill, generate all your Spirit back for even more damage. 47-second cooldown for that, though? Really? You couldn't, like, shave that down to 30? 35? It's just not worth it. Like, an Earth Druid would rather run Boulder, Landslide, Earth Spike, Earthen Bulwark, and then instead of running an ultimate, you'd run a companion. Like, you wouldn't run that. And that's pure Earth. Wouldn't even run it. And then there's Lacerate. Okay, you become a werewolf, you get complete immunity, dash around, hit enemies for massive damage in between. Okay? Now, here's the thing. The immunity redeems it. But the effects aren't great. Each time Lacerate deals a crit, you heal 5% max life. The initial strike is guaranteed to crit and deal bonus damage. The damage in the area is very inconsistent. And enemies can move out of the area. There's no bonus damage against bosses or single target. There's no real way to plus this. It's mostly just crit, heal, damage immunity. This is a defensive skill as an ultimate, and I really don't like those because I prefer having better defensive options. It's not a terrible skill. It's pretty good. But again, Storm Druid, like Storm Werewolf Druid, won't run this. Pure Poison Werewolf won't really run this. Because they would rather run Poison Creeper again than they would run this. So it's kind of in a niche situation where it's not good enough to get run, but it has unique value in defensive-oriented builds. For the key passives, the Ursane Strength and Lupine Ferocity are obviously good in solo Shapeshift build. Obviously, you're going to run that. Bestial Rage is also decently good in those same builds, because the bonus Werewolf and Werebear effect is very good if you're able to keep that bonus up off of the unique version of each. Now, Ursane Strength is better in for Werebear, given that you get the bonus life and the bonus health, as opposed to, you know, 30% increased damage for 15 seconds. And then anytime you shapeshift out of Werebear, whether it's for Bulwark, whether it's for companion skill, you know, you kind of lose that benefit. I'm okay with that. Lupine Ferocity's good. Same thing in the pure werewolf build. The attack speed can be really good as a version of it, but it suffers from the same issue. If you go human, whether it's for, you know, Bulwark, Cyclone, companion scale, and lose the benefit, it's still decent enough. Why are we covering this? A lot of people say that Perfect Storm is terrible. I disagree. 15% bonus damage against vulnerable, immobilized, or slowed enemies is massively good. Nature's Fury. Everybody knows Nature's Fury is good. Here's the problem, though. Earth and Might. If you're an Earth Druid, you know what you're going to run? You're going to run Nature's Fury because you get 30% chance to cast a Storm skill, which gives you vulnerable and immobilized procs. And that's something that you don't have a lot of. you can slow a lot, you can crit a lot, you can stun a lot. You don't vulnerable and immobilize as much. You can, but you don't do it as much. Nature's Fury gives you that. Here's what Earth and Might does. Lucky hit, damage, 5% chance, either guaranteed crits, which is nice, but you crit a lot as is. You don't need to guarantee you're going to crit for 5 seconds. That is not as big of a damage bonus as you think it is, because you crit a lot on Earth. Or restore all of your spirit, which is nice. Here's the thing. Wind Shear can do that for you. And it's a better lucky hit chance, because it's 7 to 10%, 7 to 14%, as opposed to 10, or as opposed to 5%. Okay? Now you can say, well, the chance is increased by 10% for any critical strike. Okay, so that means you have a 15% chance. Or it's a 25% if the target is stunned, immobilized, or knockback. Here's the thing. You're not getting immobilize off of Earth skills. You're not getting knockback off of Earth skills except Boulder. So you're really only getting it off the crit or off of Nature's Fury, which you can't run. So in my opinion, this needs a much bigger buff. Like, what I would do is this. I would increase the lucky hit chance to 10% flat, remove the bonus chance, and put up 3 more possible gains. So, restore all your spirit, all your strikes are critical strikes for 5 seconds, right? Leave those. Put up heal 20% of your maximum life. Put up fortify for 25% of your maximum life instantly. Put up cooldown reduction on all skills by 2 seconds. Put those up the amount to 10%. I think it's fine at that point. And just remove the bonus on it. This is like the one skill that's outmatched. Like, completely outmatched in the key passives. It's kind of like Kalen's Edict, where, like, if you're Earth, you rather run Nature's Fury. If you're Storm, you're running Perfect Storm anyways. You know, if you're Werebear with Earth skills, you're running one of these two. There is no reason to run this right now. But anyway, that is the least useful skills. I hope you enjoyed.